sleep. Williams with a steal.
Welcome back to Clark USA fans. Here's Clark. From beyond the logo and the shot drops. The kind of moment that doesn't just score points, it freezes time. A last-second play that silences an entire stadium, the kind where even the noise forgets how to exist. Every sport has that moment. The one that pulls people out of scrolling, out of distraction, out of everything, and forces them to watch. For years, those moments belonged to other leagues, other stars, other stories. But then something changed. The WNBA found its moment, and it arrived in the form of one player who didn't just step onto the court. She shifted the gravity of the entire sport. When Caitlin Clark walked into the league, she didn't just bring skill. She brought attention, pressure, expectation, and something far more dangerous, comparison. Within months, arenas that once echoed with empty seats were turning fans away at the doors. Broadcasters who had ignored the league for years were suddenly cutting into programming just to show her games. Social media feeds were flooded, highlight reels went viral within minutes, and conversations that had never included the WNBA suddenly couldn't avoid it. But here's the part nobody talks about openly. Getting the spotlight is one thing. Standing in it, holding it steady, and performing under it without cracking, that's something entirely different. And right now, the league is being tested in ways it never anticipated. There's a number that doesn't get discussed loudly enough. 9 million. That's how many people tuned in to watch the NCAA championship game in April 2024, when Clark and Iowa faced South Carolina. It wasn't just a big game, it was a cultural moment. The most watched women's college basketball game in American history. More viewers than many NBA playoff games that same year. That doesn't just happen. That level of attention doesn't appear randomly. It builds around something magnetic, something rare. And at that moment, Caitlin Clark wasn't just a player, she was a phenomenon. She broke records that were never supposed to be touched. Pete Maravich's all-time NCAA scoring record had stood for over 5 decades, untouched by generations of talent. And then Clark didn't just reach it, she passed it with a style that felt almost unreal. It wasn't brute strength or overwhelming athleticism. It was creativity, vision, confidence. Logo threes that felt reckless until they went in. No-look passes that bent the logic of the game. Full-court assists that made defenders look frozen in time. Watching her didn't feel routine. It felt like witnessing something unfolding in real time that you knew people would talk about years later. And the fans felt it. College arenas that once held modest, polite crowds suddenly became packed weeks in advance. Road games turned into home crowds for Clark. People weren't just attending, they were traveling. Driving hours, crossing states, just to say they had seen it live. That kind of pull doesn't belong to a typical athlete. That belongs to someone who becomes bigger than the game itself. So when she entered the WNBA draft in 2024, expectations weren't just high. They were historic. The Indiana Fever selected her first overall, and from that exact moment, something inside the league shifted. Not gradually, not carefully, instantly. Her first preseason game drew more viewers than most regular season games the league had aired in years. That's not a small jump. That's a signal. And the signal was clear. Something new had arrived, and it wasn't slowing down. Every road game featuring the Fever became an event. Cities that hadn't sold out arenas in years suddenly couldn't keep up with ticket demand. Teams that had struggled to fill seats were now hosting packed crowds the moment Indiana came to town. Seattle, Chicago, Atlanta, everywhere she played, attendance records started falling. And from the outside, it looked perfect. Growth, exposure, momentum. Everything the league had been working toward for decades was finally happening. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because the WNBA had been building toward growth slowly.
Clock to one, Lloyd, oh yeah!
Carefully, methodically, a steady climb, one step at a time. And then Clark arrived, and what was supposed to take 5 years happened in 5 months. That kind of acceleration doesn't just change numbers. It changes pressure. It changes expectations. It changes everything. Most conversations about Clark's impact stay on the surface. Bigger crowds, higher ratings, more revenue. But what actually changed was deeper than that. Before her arrival, the league could afford to be imperfect. Small mistakes didn't become headlines. Questionable decisions didn't spark national debates. When the audience is small, the margin for error is wide. But when someone like Clark brings millions of eyes with her, that margin disappears. Suddenly, every game wasn't just being watched by fans. It was being analyzed by journalists, executives, sponsors, and critics who had never paid attention before. First impressions were forming in real time, and they weren't always forgiving. That's a level of scrutiny the league had never experienced at that scale. Think about what that means for an organization. Systems that were designed for a smaller stage are suddenly being tested on a massive one. Communication, officiating, scheduling, discipline, everything is under a microscope. And overnight, the league is being compared to giants like the NFL and the NBA, organizations that have had decades to refine every detail. The standard didn't just rise, it jumped. There's a concept in business called a growth trap. It happens when success arrives faster than the system can handle, when demand outpaces preparation. And that's exactly what happened here. The league didn't struggle because it lacked talent or value. It struggled because the speed of its rise exposed cracks that had never mattered before. And here's the truth that often gets misunderstood. Caitlin Clark wasn't the problem. She was, and still is, the biggest opportunity the league has seen in a generation. But opportunity at that scale comes with pressure, and pressure reveals weaknesses. On the surface, the 2024 season looked like a celebration. Attendance jumped dramatically. Ratings surged. Merchandise flew off shelves. Social media engagement exploded. Every measurable metric pointed upward. By all traditional standards, it was the most successful season in league history. But inside the arenas, something else was happening. Longtime fans, the ones who had supported the league when it wasn't popular, started to feel something unexpected. Displacement. The energy in the arenas was louder, more intense, more chaotic. But it was different. It didn't feel like the same community. It felt less like a basketball crowd and more like an event crowd, like a concert where the game was just part of the experience. And that shift created tension. New fans were arriving in massive numbers, many of them drawn specifically by Clark. Old fans saw their space changing, their culture evolving, their identity being reshaped. Social media became a battleground. Debates turned into arguments. Support turned into division. Some fans felt protective of what the league had been, while others were excited about what it was becoming. And in the middle of all of it was one player who didn't just bring attention. She changed the expectations of what the league could be. Because this wasn't just about basketball anymore. It was about visibility, growth, identity, and the challenge of evolving without losing what made the league unique in the first place. The real question isn't whether Caitlin Clark changed the WNBA. That part is obvious. The real question is whether the league can adapt fast enough to keep up with what she started. Because moments like this don't wait. They don't slow down. And they don't come around often. And what happens next might define the future of the entire league.
She can't believe it!
The infrastructure wasn't ready. The staffing wasn't ready. The communication systems weren't ready. And as the 2024 season unfolded under a spotlight brighter than anything the league had ever experienced, one specific area exposed those weaknesses more clearly than anything else: security, both on the court and around it. What had once been manageable in a quieter environment suddenly became impossible to ignore when millions of new eyes were watching every possession, every whistle, every reaction. The margin for error had disappeared, and the league was learning that lesson in real time. At multiple points during the season, incidents involving Caitlin Clark didn't just stay within the game. They spilled into national conversation. Hard fouls, visible frustration, physical play that crossed the line from competitive to questionable. In another era, in another context, many of those moments might have been handled swiftly, quietly, and without much attention. But this was no longer that version of the WNBA. Every clip was replayed. Every angle was analyzed. Every decision was judged, not just by fans of a league, but by an entirely new audience that had arrived with expectations shaped by other major sports organizations. And that's where the real issue emerged, not the incidents themselves, but the response to them. The league's reactions often felt slow, inconsistent, and at times confusing even to those who followed closely. Similar actions resulted in different consequences. One player might receive a fine, another a warning, and another nothing at all. The lack of clear, consistent standards created a perception problem, and perception in a moment like this matters just as much as reality. Press releases didn't clarify, they raised more questions. Statements felt reactive, as if the league was trying to keep up with the conversation instead of leading it. And the audience noticed every single detail. Because growth had arrived and with it came accountability, there's something that sounds almost counterintuitive until you really think about it. Smaller leagues don't get criticized the way larger ones do. When a league operates in a niche space, with smaller audiences and limited media attention, mistakes don't carry the same weight. They fade quickly. They aren't amplified. There isn't a constant cycle of analysis and debate surrounding every decision. But the moment a league becomes relevant, truly relevant, everything changes. Every action is examined. Every inconsistency is highlighted. Every silence becomes part of the story. That's exactly what the WNBA experienced during this period. Relevance didn't just bring attention, it brought scrutiny. And scrutiny doesn't wait for you to prepare. It arrives fully formed. One particular moment captured this shift perfectly. A widely circulated clip showed a hard foul committed against Caitlin Clark during a game. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't ambiguous. By most reasonable interpretations, it crossed into flagrant territory. The kind of play that, in other leagues, often results in immediate and decisive consequences. The league responded with a $1,000 fine. On paper, that might have seemed appropriate within the league's existing structure. But context matters. In the same year, NBA players were being fined tens of thousands of dollars for actions that, in comparison, didn't carry the same physical implications. Now, direct comparisons between leagues aren't entirely fair. The financial ecosystems are vastly different. But audiences don't always evaluate fairness through internal logic. They evaluate through optics. And the optics in that moment were difficult to defend. Sports media picked up the story almost instantly. Social media turned it into an ongoing debate that stretched for days. Analysts discussed it on national television. Former players shared their perspectives. And perhaps most importantly, new fans, people who had only recently begun paying attention to the WNBA, were forming their first impressions of how the league operates under pressure. That's the hidden cost of relevance. When nobody is watching, mistakes stay quiet. When everyone is watching, even small missteps become defining moments. There's a concept often discussed in organizational behavior called scale shock. It describes the moment when an institution grows so quickly that its internal systems can no longer support its external image. From the outside, everything looks like success, growth, popularity, momentum. But inside, the systems are strained, stretched, and struggling to keep up with the demands being placed on them. That's exactly what was happening here. The WNBA had reached a level of visibility that demanded a higher standard across every aspect of its operation. Officiating needed to be sharper. Communication needed to be clearer. Discipline needed to be consistent. And most importantly, decisions needed to be understood not just internally but publicly.
The last two games of this regular season is Citron takes and makes from deep.
Because in this new environment, transparency wasn't optional, it was expected. Scale shock always comes with a warning. Fix the systems while the goodwill still exists, or risk losing that goodwill when the cracks become too visible to ignore. And just as the league was navigating these growing pains, another challenge emerged, one that had been building quietly for years but now couldn't be ignored anymore. The conversation around player compensation. In early 2025, the league and its players entered negotiations for a new collective bargaining agreement. On the surface, this was a routine part of professional sports. Contracts expire. Terms are renegotiated. Agreements are updated. But the timing of this negotiation made it different. It came at a moment when the league was experiencing unprecedented attention, unprecedented growth, and unprecedented financial movement. For years, player salaries in the WNBA had been a point of discussion, but not always a central one. The maximum salary for a player in 2024 was around $241,000. In contrast, even the lowest-paid players in the NBA earned significantly more. At the highest level, the gap became even more dramatic. But those differences had always been explained through a combination of factors: revenue disparities, historical development, media deals, and overall market size. And to be fair, those explanations weren't entirely wrong. Building a sports league is complex. Revenue streams matter. Sustainability matters. Growth takes time. But something shifted in 2024 that made those long-standing arguments harder to maintain without question. The numbers started to change. Games featuring Caitlin Clark were drawing television audiences that began to rival mid-tier NBA playoff matchups. Networks that had once hesitated to invest in women's basketball were now competing for broadcasting rights. Major platforms entered the conversation. Sponsorship deals expanded. Brands that had never considered involvement with the league suddenly saw opportunity. The financial landscape wasn't just improving, it was accelerating. And the players saw it. The collective bargaining negotiations became more than just a discussion about salary figures. They became a reflection of something deeper, a question about value. What were players worth in this new version of the league? Not the old version. Not the version that existed 5 years ago. The current one. The one drawing millions of viewers. The one generating new revenue streams. The one filling arenas across the country. This is where the situation became delicate. Because the league wasn't just negotiating contracts, it was negotiating its identity in real time. And it was doing so under the watchful eyes of multiple groups, all with different expectations. Longtime fans, new fans, sponsors, broadcasters, investors, each one interpreting the negotiations through their own lens. For new fans especially, this moment carried extra weight. They had just discovered the league. Their loyalty was still forming. Their connection was still developing. And now, one of their first major impressions involved conflict, negotiation, and uncertainty. That doesn't mean disagreement is inherently bad. Negotiations are a normal part of professional sports. But how those negotiations are perceived can shape how an audience feels about the stability and direction of a league. At the center of it all was a simple but powerful question. Had the league fully recognized how much things had changed? Players weren't just asking for higher salaries. They were asking for acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that the product had grown, that the audience had expanded.
KT even put it in.
That the revenue potential had shifted. That the league they were playing in was no longer the same as it had been in previous years. At the same time, ownership faced its own realities. Not every franchise experienced the same level of growth. Not every market benefited equally from the surge in attention. Some teams were still operating at a loss. Financial caution wasn't just a preference, it was a necessity. Rapid increases in salary without guaranteed long-term revenue could create instability, especially for smaller markets. And that's what made the situation genuinely complex. Neither side was entirely wrong. Both perspectives were grounded in reality, which is exactly why the resolution wasn't simple. Because in any negotiation like this, the real risk isn't disagreement, it's distance. The moment when both sides stop listening and start defending. When compromise becomes harder, when progress slows. And during that time, the audience, the fans who are still deciding whether to stay engaged, begins to drift. History has shown how fragile moments like this can be. Entire seasons in professional sports have been lost to unresolved labor disputes. Momentum, once interrupted, doesn't always return in the same form. And for a league experiencing rapid growth for the first time on this scale, that risk carries even more weight. The WNBA found itself at a crossroads. On one side, unprecedented opportunity. On the other, the pressure of expectation, the challenge of adaptation, and the responsibility to evolve without losing control of its own trajectory. Because growth isn't just about getting bigger. It's about becoming stronger at the same time. And the leagues that succeed in moments like this aren't the ones that avoid challenges. They're the ones that recognize them early, respond clearly, and build systems that can support the future they're stepping into. The question now isn't whether the WNBA can grow. That part is already happening. The real question is whether it can stabilize, adapt, and lead at the level its new audience expects. Because the spotlight isn't going anywhere.
By her, and she...
Survival and momentum are not the same thing. A league can survive chaos, criticism, and even its own mistakes, but survival alone doesn't guarantee growth, and it certainly doesn't guarantee relevance. Momentum is different. Momentum is fragile. It's built slowly, often over years, and it can disappear much faster than it arrives. What happens in moments of rapid change doesn't just influence the present, it defines the future. And right now, the WNBA is standing in one of those defining moments, the kind that history tends to repeat in different forms across every major sport. If you go back and study the history of successful leagues, you'll notice a pattern. None of them rose in a straight line. None of them were perfect. In fact, most of them went through periods where their future looked uncertain, unstable, and in some cases, almost unsalvageable. The NBA in the 1970s is one of the clearest examples. Today, it's a global powerhouse, a cultural force that extends far beyond basketball. But there was a time when that future wasn't guaranteed at all. Games weren't consistently broadcast on national television. Incredibly, some finals games weren't even shown live. They were aired on tape delay, meaning fans watched the championship outcome hours after it had already happened. Imagine that in today's world. It's almost unthinkable. The league struggled with its image. There were concerns about professionalism, concerns about player behavior, and concerns about whether fans would continue to care. Attendance wasn't where it needed to be. Media coverage was inconsistent. And for a period of time, there was a very real question about whether the NBA could sustain itself long-term. But then came a shift, not instant, not explosive, but steady and deliberate. Magic Johnson and Larry Bird arrived and brought with them a rivalry that captured attention. Then came Michael Jordan, who didn't just elevate the game, he transformed it into something global. But even with those generational talents, the league's rise didn't happen overnight. It required decisions, strategic broadcasting deals, marketing investments, a commitment to building stars and telling their stories in a way that connected with audiences beyond a court. The NFL followed a similar path, though its challenges looked different. For much of the mid-20th century, baseball dominated American sports culture. Football was considered secondary, regional, and at times even too rough for mainstream appeal. But over decades, the league made intentional choices. It refined its rules to make the game more engaging for viewers. It invested heavily in television partnerships. And perhaps most importantly, it turned the Super Bowl into something bigger than a game. It became a cultural event. Something people watched even if they didn't follow football. That kind of transformation doesn't happen by accident. It happens when an organization recognizes a moment and acts on it with clarity and consistency. That's where the WNBA finds itself now. Not at the beginning of its journey, but at a turning point within it. The attention is here. The audience is growing. The conversation is louder than it has ever been. But attention alone isn't enough. The next phase depends entirely on what the league does with it. The first and most immediate need is transparency. In a league that is now being watched by millions, silence creates confusion, and confusion creates mistrust. When incidents happen, whether it's a controversial foul, a disciplinary decision, or a policy change, the response needs to be fast, clear, and consistent. Not just internally understood, but publicly explained. Fans today don't just want outcomes. They want reasoning. They want to understand why decisions are made, and they want to see that those decisions follow a standard that applies to everyone equally. Without that clarity, even correct decisions can feel questionable. The second priority is infrastructure. Growth at this scale demands a foundation that can support it. That includes everything from arena quality to staffing, from broadcast production to officiating standards. When a league operates on a smaller stage, imperfections can exist without major consequences. But on a larger stage, those same imperfections become visible, and visibility changes perception. If the league is now being compared to major sports organizations, then its operational quality needs to reflect that level of comparison. That doesn't happen overnight, but it has to begin immediately. The third priority is resolution, specifically, resolving the collective bargaining agreement in a way that avoids disruption. It doesn't need to be perfect. In fact, it won't be. No negotiation ever satisfies every party completely. But it needs to be stable. It needs to provide a path forward that both players and ownership can accept without escalating into a work stoppage. Because at this moment, continuity matters more than perfection.
Over 2K in her career. And a statement.
The league cannot afford to lose momentum just as it has finally captured widespread attention. The fourth priority is perhaps the most complex, and it's one that doesn't get discussed as openly as it should. The league needs to build stars beyond Caitlin Clark. Not because Clark is a problem. She is, without question, one of the most important figures the league has ever had, but because no league can sustain long-term success on the back of a single player. What happens if she gets injured? What happens if her performance dips for a period of time? What happens if the narrative shifts? A strong league doesn't rely on one story. It builds many. Players like Aya Wilson represent the kind of talent that should be at the center of the league's identity. Dominant, consistent, accomplished. The kind of player who defines excellence at the highest level. And yet, the level of recognition she receives doesn't always match her impact. The same can be said for others. Players who have built incredible careers, won championships, represented their country, and still operate without the level of mainstream visibility that newer audiences are just beginning to understand. Rising talents like Paige Buchers also represent the future, players who have the potential to carry their own audiences, create their own narratives, and expand the league's reach even further. But that only happens if the league actively invests in telling their stories, promoting their journeys, and positioning them as more than just supporting figures in a single-player narrative. Because a league built on one name isn't a structure, it's a spotlight. And spotlights move. Then there's the conversation that exists just beneath the surface, one that is far more complex and far more sensitive than anything else the league is dealing with. It's not always said directly, but it's present. In locker rooms, in media discussions, in fan debates. The intersection of race, visibility, and recognition within the league's growth. The WNBA has always been a league with a strong foundation of Black athletes. For most of its history, those players carried the league through years of limited exposure, limited sponsorship, and limited mainstream attention. They built the game, sustained it, and represented it at the highest level, often without the recognition that matched their contributions. Then came a moment where everything shifted rapidly. A new star entered the league with an already established fan base, a player who had captured national attention at the college level and brought that attention with her into the professional space.
Barker out to Alamang, lets it fly from three, she got it!
And suddenly, the cameras were there. The sponsorships increased. The conversations expanded. The visibility changed. For some, this is simply the result of market dynamics. A player with a massive following entering a league and bringing that audience along. For others, it raises more difficult questions about why that level of attention arrived when it did, and what it says about the broader landscape of sports media and cultural focus. Both perspectives can exist at the same time, and that's what makes the conversation so challenging. Because this isn't about assigning blame to any individual player. It's not about diminishing what Caitlin Clark has accomplished or the impact she has had. She didn't create the system. She didn't design the dynamics. She stepped into them and succeeded within them. But the league, as an institution, has a responsibility to recognize the full picture. To ensure that its growth story isn't one where recognition is unevenly distributed despite equal levels of talent, dedication, and achievement. Because if that imbalance continues, it creates a foundation that isn't stable. Players like Breanna Stewart have built careers that deserve deeper storytelling, broader exposure, and greater recognition. Aya Wilson's dominance deserves to be understood by a wider audience. Other stars across the league bring skill, personality, and impact that could resonate far beyond current levels of visibility, if given the platform to do so. Every league that has reached sustained greatness has faced a moment like this. A moment where growth created both opportunity and tension. A moment where decisions carried long-term consequences. The leagues that succeed aren't the ones that avoid difficult conversations. They're the ones that engage with them honestly and use them as a foundation for stronger systems. The WNBA is in that moment now. The audience is here. The financial interest is growing. The players are ready. The stories are there. What remains is execution, the ability to turn all of this into something lasting. Because moments don't last forever. Attention shifts. Audiences move. What feels permanent can disappear if it isn't supported by structure, strategy, and consistency. Turning a moment into a movement is the hardest part of any transformation. It requires patience, clarity, and a willingness to evolve without losing direction. It requires understanding that growth isn't the finish line. It's the starting point of a new level of expectation. And right now, the league stands at that exact point. The spotlight is brighter than it has ever been. The opportunity is larger than it has ever been. But so is the responsibility. Because the same attention that built this moment can just as quickly move on if it isn't given a reason to stay. So the question isn't whether the WNBA has arrived. The question is whether it's ready to become what this moment demands. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the league is handling this the right way? Because this conversation is just getting started. And we're here to break down the stories behind the stories every single week.